Good evening, John Florance here, welcoming you to this evening's Bardi interview, when I'll be talking to David Calow, who really needs no introduction, but I will say that he is the director of the Bardi Wind Orchestra and has been associated with the Bardi Symphony Orchestra right from the start. The Wind Orchestra was in fact the brainchild of David and Robert Calow, and since receiving the blessing of the Bardi Committee in 1992, they brought a new dimension to non-professional musical output of the Bardi, bringing in new audiences and providing a showcase for many of Leicestershire's brass and wind players. Well, over the next hour or so, I'll be finding out a lot more about David's wide-ranging career of music making and conducting in the city and county. A very good evening to you, David.
And good evening, John. How are you?
I'm very well indeed, thank you, and I hope you are too. Now, of course, we spoke to your twin brother, Robert.
You did.
Not long ago, and we covered quite a lot about the Calow family and about your origins as sweeps and so on and so forth. So we're going to stick really to you and your involvement in music. And the first thing I'd like to ask you is when, presumably as quite a young child, you first felt the power of music.
I think it's listening to the radio and the sort of record players that were on at the time at home. You've got Dad playing the whole gamut of light music, as it were. There was very little classical music. They certainly didn't listen to Radio 3. It wasn't that sort of household, but we had the music of the musicals, the film themes, and that sort of stuff all around us from the early age.
Well, film themes will be recurring during the course of this programme, I have no doubt.
It will.
But, can you remember the first time that you saw a symphony concert, presumably at the De Montfort Hall?
It was indeed, and that's one of the first things I think we'll actually listen to quite soon. Robert and myself were taken to the De Montfort Hall to see the great Mantovani Orchestra in 1969. And of course, when you're sort of an 8, 9-year-old, to see a full orchestra on the stage at De Montfort playing all this fantastic music, whether it's musicals, films, and lighter music, it was just wonderful. And I can clearly remember the excitement of seeing all the strings perhaps for the first time and the sound of the brass. It was excellent.
Well, you're quite right. There's nothing quite so exciting as seeing a big symphony orchestra going at full pelt. It's not just the sound, it's the drama of watching it. It always comes alive for me in the Rite of Spring, in those big moments in that, where everyone is blowing and bashing and plucking, and it just looks wonderful, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, we've often said with the Bardi Wind Orchestra, when it's been videoed by Alan, we're not a very exciting bunch to look at, because it's the violins that make an orchestra look exciting when you realise. So, but yeah, the Mantovani Orchestra, we were so privileged to see them. That was at his height, really, in the 60s.
They were big stars. I mean, Mantovani was a big star, and indeed got into what was called, the top 10 there with Swedish Rhapsody, if memory.
That's right. And apparently the albums of his film music, they were the biggest grossing albums in the world in the will collect music until the Beatles turned up.
I mean, it's something which you couldn't have these days, an independent orchestra playing like classics and touring the country.
Yes, I mean, he had obviously a pedigree second to none. His father was the concertmaster to Toscanini at La Scala. So when you've got that sort of background, and he came over to this country, he moved to England in 1912, apparently. Married over.
And also, he had, as the leader of the orchestra, someone who was famous by association with his son, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, and apparently Mum and Dad remembered hearing this, that Mantovani would always say, we have Mr. McCallum, David McCallum Sr. leading the orchestra. We can't afford the son, David McCallum, the actor. Because, of course, he was a huge star on the television and film at the time.
That's right. He was, I mean, the Man from U.N.C.L.E.
was the Man from U.N.C.L.E.
that made him, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Now, your first piece of music, as you suggested, is played by Mantovani. And I said that we were going to hear film music, and blow me, it's your first choice. Would you like to introduce it for us?
It is, and it's one piece of music I can clearly remember hearing at this concert and of the subsequent records, and it was the theme to The Big Country, one of my favourite film themes, both to listen to and also to conduct. I've conducted it several times, both with the Symphony Orchestra and with the Bardi Wind Orchestra, and it's just such exciting stuff to do.
Let's listen then. The Big Country, played by Mantovani and his orchestra. The
Wow.
music of Jerome Moross. The Big Country, the theme to that film, played by Mantovani and Orchestra. Uh, the choice of David Calow. What a wonderful piece of music that is, David. I never noticed those little runs in the piano before. Was that part of an arrangement that was made for Mantovani?
No, that's a proper harp part.
Oh, it's a harp part.
It's a superb harp
piano
part.
to me. Yeah.
It's a brilliant harp, but there's some brilliant touches in it. The harp part is superb. It's film music. It's the muted trumpets at the end and lots of scurrying on the viola and the clarinets. There's a lot in it for a film theme. It's brilliantly composed.
Well, thank you for that choice. Let's move on to your career as a musician now. What was the first instrument you picked up then?
The recorder was the first instrument, like you did in the 60s. If the school had any sort of music, it was going to be a recorder. And I can clearly remember having some grotty old Adler recorder that played something and you had to keep it clean. And I think we graduated to a slightly better one when we were about 9 or 10. And that was it, really. There wasn't many schools in the city of Leicester that had any other sort of musical instrumentation going on. You could sing in the school choir, which Robert and myself did, and thoroughly enjoyed that. So it was recorder and singing at that level of school until we got to the grammar school.
And there you are, sitting in an orchestra with your flute. And when was that taken? Do you know?
That's about 1976, 77. So it's at Gateway Grammar School in the school band. So I've been playing the flute for about 4.5 or 5 years by that stage.
And was the flute really love at first sight then?
Not at all, in the sense that I think we went through, you turn up at the grammar school, you play the recorder, and then you see a cupboard full of brass and clarinets, and Robert chose a clarinet. I didn't want to play the same instrument, and brass sort of ensemble stuff didn't appeal to me at the time, although it does now. And then that was it. And then somewhere nearer Christmas, what turned out to be a very good friend of mine and my first flute teacher, a chap called Des Jones, turned up at the school and played the flute in assembly, stood up and played it in front of us all. And I thought, okay, that looks very interesting. I'll go and ask Mum, can I play the flute? So I think they looked in the back of the Leicester Mercury and there was an old Chinese flute for sale for not a lot. And that was my first instrument.
And did you listen to music at home and listen out for the flute parts in that music?
Not originally, but then when you got to know what Dad's record collection was, once we went past the perhaps the themes from the musicals and the lighter music, yes, listen to Mantovani's film stuff, you can hear the flute stuff, but it was a classic box selection, a Reader's Digest box, and there it is. That is probably the most inspirational and influential music record box that we had as children, as it were, growing up. So the booklet took you through each composer, told you what they did, and the pieces of music in that box, being typical the Reader's Digest, were the best of the good classical work. So you could listen to the big chunks of Wagner, the famous pieces, the Strauss waltzes, and all the standard orchestral repertoire. So that's the first time I heard, for instance, the wonderful flute solo at the beginning of Bolero, and then also the wonderful flute solo that's in Bizet's Carmen from the Entr'acte.
Well, we're going to hear a bit of Carmen in a moment, but just before we get on to that, I mean, when you listen to those pieces of music, those bits of flute music at any rate, presumably you thought, I'd really like to play those. And did you try and, put them down on paper in notes or what?
It did do. You have to sort of remind yourself what time we are then. It's pre-internet, it's pre-photocopiers. Unless you could go down to Breeze Music and Churchgate, which was probably the best music shop, or going to Goldsmith Music Library, you couldn't actually find any music to play from that point of view. It's obviously so much easier in this day and age. So I started to write this solo down, and there you can see the music. And it's the second bar that threw me, because we'd had no musical theory training at all or anything like that. And I couldn't work out what the triplet was in the second beat. I knew how to play it, but I couldn't notate it down. And I've actually still got the piece of paper in the loft somewhere.
Doubtless you will donate this to an American university when you retire.
I doubt it, John. I doubt it. But that was the first piece I tried to play because it was such a gorgeous piece of music. The only problem is, of course, it goes up to a top B flat, and I had no idea what even the top G was by that stage early on. But it's a piece I've grown to love, and it's a wonderful duet to play because, of course, once I played my first 16 bars, the clarinet plays the melody, and most of the times I play it, my brother plays the clarinet part.
It's very fortuitous and rather delightful, isn't it?
It is.
Now,
so we know this piece very well.
we're to see a very fascinating piece of video. Would you like to introduce it for us, please?
Yeah, I thought, because it's to do with the flute, that it would be quite nice to see not James Galway, who, of course, was one of my inspirations growing up in the early 70s, but his his successor, as in he's the principal flute of the Berlin Philharmonic, Emmanuel Pahud. Now, this is from a concert in 2011 conducted by Dudamel in the Philharmonic Hall in Berlin. And it just shows you, when you're given one of the best flutes in the world, probably a solid gold flute, what you can do with the instrument with this wonderful solo.
It's a gold flute he's playing then, is it?
It is. I've done a bit of research on the internet. Apparently he's now playing on a 14-carat Haynes gold flute. Now, Haynes is the top American brand, which means he's probably signed up to their books promoting it all. But he used to have a Brennan Cooper flute before, but that was 14-carat gold as well. So he's used to very good instruments.
Do you really think that gold makes an impact on the sound that he produces?
It does. It does. We were fortunate to go and see James Galway at De Montfort Hall when he came in the late 80s, and he played on 3 different flutes: a gold flute, a wooden flute with a silver head, and a platinum flute, to demonstrate what the different sounds do. And you could clearly hear the difference. The gold one is the most resonant and the warmest sound.
Well, I can remember that concert because I interviewed him before it.
Oh,
for radio.
John, you probably did, yes.
Yeah, and he was full of wonderful stories about how he started playing in Belfast and this sort of thing. And he had this rather endearing habit of calling the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra as Herbie.
Herbie, yeah.
Herbie von Karajan, you know.
That's right.
Okay, so let's see and hear then this very well-known piece from Bizet's Carmen. Well, more music to send a shiver down the spine, really, wasn't it? That was Emmanuel Pahud, principal flautist with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Dudamel, and that was the entr'acte from Carmen by Bizet. And Dudamel, another man who has appeared at the De Montfort Hall, who I spoke to before the concert, and he was like a vitamin pill on legs, quite an extraordinary fellow.
Really.
When you listen to that kind of tone that he gets out of that instrument, it's very caressing and resonant, and it's beautiful, isn't it?
That's what the gold does. And it's interesting, somebody commented on that YouTube video, the difference between the wooden flute that plays the second flute entry first, and then his flute takes over.
Absolutely gorgeous. Well, now we move on to something rather different. And this is something, of course, Robert spoke about as well, your shared love of James Bond, films, books, memorabilia, everything to do with 007. When did that start?
Back in the 60s, in its heyday, and we look back thinking, to be children of the 60s, it was the perfect time to fall in love with James Bond. It was Connery's golden era, of course. So once you see James Bond at the cinema, you hear the music, you're hooked. And 1967 was the year.
And what was the first Bond film you saw?
First Bond film we saw, and people are going to be aghast who don't know what happened then. We saw a double bill, would you believe, of Goldfinger and Thunderball in the Odeon in Leicester. And then we followed it up, went over to Loughborough to the Curzon Cinema and saw Dr. No and From Russia with Love. So we'd caught up the first 4 by the time the big one came out in June 1967.
And that was?
You Only Live Twice.
You Only Live Twice.
Yeah. So the first one we saw live, as it were, as a brand new film. And
you say that it was John Barry's music which really, struck you then?
It is, because I can think, it's like listening to Bolero. The first time you hear it, you can remember things from it. So it was a flute solo, but it's the trombones doing the glissando. And in John Barry's music, it was the richness of the sound and perhaps the strings and a lot of the alto flute stuff that he uses in it. So there's a nice big flute element in his music.
He's got a wonderful sense of when music is needed and what sort of music you need. And for each film that he's written, he really does write something different. I mean, there are some film composers who have got a style that's immediately recognisable. And to some extent, that's true, I suppose, of Barry. But on the other hand, he does write very different music for different films, doesn't he?
If you look at his back catalogue, it's amazing the amount of films he has been embroiled in. And something like Midnight Cowboy that he won his Oscar for, that's a sort of more of an eclectic mixture of all sorts of music. He only wrote 3 pieces for it, but it was then his knowledge and his bringing together all these diverse bits and bobs. But no, I think towards the end of his life, his music becomes a little bit more somber and slower and does become a bit more samey, but it still becomes very rich, emotional, and amongst his greatest film scores are the ones in the golden era from the 80s and 90s.
You weren't only bowled over by the music and the films. You got very involved. I think you were a member of the James Bond fan club, all the memorabilia, different editions of the books and all that sort of thing. You became quite a nerd, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think, again, just like seeing those golden age films in the 60s, Robert and I started collecting our Bond books at the end of that era into the early 70s. And you can't get a lot of those books now because certainly the paperbacks and the early editions, they don't exist. They were pulped or have been got rid of. So our collection is quite a rarity, really, and the amount of stuff we've got.
You've still got them all then?
Yes, they're in this room behind me somewhere.
You also had the great privilege and pleasure of seeing John Barry actually perform live, I think.
We did. Once he'd done in 1992, the LP movie Ola, which was, I think he realised that if he didn't do the best of his own music, somebody else would beat him to it. So he did. He teamed up with the Royal Philharmonic again and did 2 superb albums with all the best of his music. Then teamed up with the English Chamber Orchestra, which he had the Decca deal with, and then took that sort of combination on tour. And we were fortuitous to see him at Symphony Hall in Birmingham.
That must have been a huge thrill.
It was, and it was a very different concert. Again, amazing. We'd seen John Williams and the London Symphony Orchestra in the same season, and that was a classical concert.
Yeah.
John Barry's was not. It had sort of big cinema lights, dry ice and all sorts, fully mic'd up orchestra. And he gave it that very big John Barry sound.
Now we're to hear music from You Only Live Twice in a moment, but you love the gadgets, as everyone does who likes James Bond films. And I think one of your favourite gadgets is actually in You Only Live Twice.
It is, and I think it's because it was the first big new film and it got all the big publicity. One of the reasons why Connery didn't want to do another one, because he was fed up with it all. But I do remember seeing Little Nelly, the little helicopter on the screen there, on Blue Peter, of all places. He became such a famous sort of part of the film. And it used to... Commander Wallace used to display it at the Leicester Air shows quite regularly, so we saw it flying with the actual pilot in it. And 2 years ago, I made my reacquaintance with Little Nelly at the Sywell Air Show, and it was sitting there with lots of stickers all over it with a big sign saying, "Do not touch me."
Well, she has to keep her virtue, I suppose.
That's
really.
right. But
we're going to talk a little bit more about You Only Live Twice in a moment, but would you like to introduce the next piece of music for us?
Yes, I mean, I thought about that. There's so much brilliant background music in the score based around what aficionados say that one of John Barry's best melodies. But in the end, I suppose what gives it that 1960s real swinging to it is to have Nancy Sinatra singing it. So here we are, Nancy Sinatra is singing You Only Live Twice.
Let's listen to it. The music of John Barry, You Only Live Twice, sung by Nancy Sinatra. And I think that song actually took quite a lot of production, didn't it?
It did do, and it's something I didn't really know about until you start to read all the books about John Barry. It was recorded on the 2nd of May, 1967, and the premiere was on the 12th of June. And I think when you see something like that, you know something's happened. And what happened was that Frank Sinatra rang Cubby Broccoli up and said, "I think my daughter ought to sing the next Bond theme." And John Barry had already written You Only Live Twice for another singer, and she'd recorded it. It's nowhere near as good as Nancy's version, but she was quite convinced that she'd done it. So with a month to go for the film premiere, he re-recorded it. Nancy Sinatra came across. And the tale is that she took over 32 takes to get it right. And he had to rearrange the music in a much lower key into B major so she could sing the lower notes. But I think she was a fish out of water, as it were. She hadn't really got the pop career off. Her dad had put her in there to do the job, and she was very, very nervous, apparently. But
it all came on all right in the end, and that's got that wonderful romantic feel to it, isn't it? Which is true of a lot of the music in that film. But the other thing that fascinates me is, well, the wonderful publicity pictures for that film. And in those days, they were specially commissioned paintings. They're not like these days when they're all photographs and from the film.
That's right. Different.
That sort of image that was created for You Only Live Twice, that's got an interesting story as well.
Yes, it's by Robert McGuinness, who was one of the famous film poster illustrators it was at the time, and he did a lot of the Bond films. And it was just very much of the era. You didn't expect to see a photograph on a movie poster. It was a big, full-colour, hand-painted montage. And again, with the artistic side of Robert and myself growing up, because that's what we do for the day job, seeing the Bond posters was just as inspirational as listening to the music. It really was.
And there is a signed copy of it, I think.
No, I think it was on the previous slide.
Oh, it was on the previous slide, was it?
The previous bit. Not the one that's got the film bit on it.
Yeah.
Just when we listened to the music, that was the actual LP cover. When he'd signed the front of it, that's the one. You can just see his signature on it.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful thing to have. And I do think that's a great image, isn't it? That really does sum up James Bond so well.
Swinging 60s, 1967, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so let's, I mean, you have mentioned the fact that the other great love of your life and that you've been involved in all your life is graphic design. That's right. And that's really gone along with your love of music as well.
It has really, and I was looking back when we were researching lots of stuff to do on this, and I think Robert alluded to, we've only actually been apart as twins for 2.5 years, but that was after the degree course when we're sort of going into our professional life. Yeah. There was 2 times before that where music nearly did break us up. And looking back on my certificate stuff, if you passed your grade 5, 6 and 8, you were given a special certificate. And if you passed your grade 8 with a distinction, which I did you were given us a chance for a scholarship at one of the Royal Colleges. I mean, who knows what would have happened? I remember speaking to my music teacher and he said, well, you've got no piano keyboard skills. You've got a lot of artistic talent. Perhaps that might be the best route to go and keep the music as a hobby. So that's what happened, really. The art took over. And again, I nearly
regretted that.
Pardon, John?
You've never regretted that then?
Well, I didn't then because it seemed such a big step. The one that really happened would have split Robert and myself up for different universities, because some of our friends in the concert band went to Bretton Hall at Wakefield. They did a combined arts and music degree.
Oh, yeah.
I did really seriously think about that. I got all the prospectus. But in the end, the lure of graphic design and Leeds Polytechnic and Leeds Town Hall was with fantastic orchestra concerts, kept us being both in the same place.
Can we just move on again to something different now? And this is your involvement with wind orchestras.
Yes.
How did that come about? And give us an idea of your activities in this area.
Well, purely by fluke, in the sense that we could have gone to a school that had an orchestra. It didn't. It had a wind band. So there it is. That's the Gateway School Band. Also within the school was the reserve facilities for the senior wind band, which Robert and I ended up in. So you start off at school playing in the wind band. So I think that gives you the flavour of the sort of music that you like to play. At the same time, the first of the Leicestershire schools and music bands we played in, under the great Brian Humperson, was the intermediate band. And there we are in the De Montfort Hall Gardens bandstand job. Now that takes us back a bit, doesn't it? Long demolished, but it used to be there, and the band was playing in the bandstand at De Montfort Hall. So that was in the mid-70s. Then we move on to the later 70s, and Robert and I were members of the Symphonic Wind Band, as it was, the school's senior concert band. So there we are playing at St Jonathan North School, and that's one of our many tours we went on. I think we went to Dieppe that year, took the band on tour to Dieppe from Leicestershire. So that took us to the end of the school time playing in wind bands.
What is there about the sound of a wind band that really attracts you then?
I think it's because there's a lot of brass in it, and also the clarinets and the flutes have a lot of the melody, because we end up being the string section.
So you're more in the spotlight than you are in a symphony.
Also, being the flute player, I sat on the end, almost in that sort of lead violin part, although I wasn't the leader as such. But yes, you end up sitting in a prime place, playing all the solo stuff. So it's great.
So you've worked with wind bands in all sorts of capacities, really throughout your sort of adult life, really. Then.
So from the school, the next one we moved on to is the British Youth Wind Orchestra, which is called the National Youth Wind Orchestra. Now, that was set up at the same time, perhaps a little bit later, from the National Youth Symphony Orchestra, but it was just as good in the sense it was the top wind and brass players. Robert and I joined, and I think Robert was on 4 of the courses. I was on 5 of the courses. The first 2 were in Leicester, which was very fortuitous. And there we are. We had major concerts in Coventry Cathedral, Royal Northern College of Music, and it was great fun.
And that really, I suppose, was one of the premier wind orchestras in the country, really.
It was the top one, because you had to audition to get into it.
Yeah.
And of course, what put us in very good stead is the experience we got with the Leicestershire School of Music. Once you got on the course, people said, "Oh, you've come from Leicestershire." They all knew about it, how good it was.
And is the wind band itself, is that an American invention?
No, I think most military ensembles have got a wind band.
Yeah.
Some description. Now, we've got our Coldstream Guards and that sort of regimental stuff. That's normally one on a part, very small ensemble. What the Americans did is added all the other instruments to it to make it more like a symphonic ensemble. And that's when it's called the American High School Band.
I was going to say the high schools are the places where you find these things, aren't
and
they?
really the Bardi Wind Orchestra, as was the British Youth Wind Orchestra, it's like an American symphonic high school band, really.
We're going to talk more about that soon, but you've been involved in other ensembles as well, including,
2 more.
This little lot. Tell us who they are.
Music Amici is the one I've been involved with the most, because once Robert and I came back from college, I came back to Leicester first. We teamed up with 1 or 2 musicians that were still around and formed a wind ensemble. That was about 1986, and we called it Music Amici, which means musical friends, and it's still going now. And then when we can do, we'll start rehearsing again. We normally rehearse every Thursday in one of the local churches, so it's been going all that time. It has
And what sort of things do you play?
All sorts of stuff. A bit of the normal classical repertoire for wind ensemble. We've done pieces like Mozart's Grand Partita, but there again, I do lots of arrangements for them for either the Christmas music or film and TV works. So it's perhaps a more popular programme.
Our next piece of music is by Nigel Hess, who I associate with themes for film and the telly. I mean, he's written a number of these things. Just explain the piece that we're going to hear.
Well, Nigel Hess is the link with the British Youth Wind Orchestra, really, because on the last course Robert and I attended, there was normally a piece especially written for the ensemble, and it was a very modern, plinky-plonky sort of piece that nobody got on with at all. Obviously, the Arts Council had given the grant for it. It was a very challenging piece to play and didn't go down very well. The next year, in 1984, Nigel Hess was commissioned to write this, East Coast Pictures, and the third movement is called New York, and I was there at the premiere at the Guildhall, and it was a staggering performance with Nigel Hess in the audience, and the whole of the audience stood up, applauded it, and they encored it straight away because it was so good. And I think that then showed the people that ran the British Youth Wind Orchestra, this is the sort of music that the younger people want to play. And his music is the benchmark for British wind music. It's superb. We've done all the big pieces. We've done Stevenson's Rocket, Thames Journey, Global Variations, and the TV Detectives, John. That's what you said. He's written lots of TV.
Yeah.
There's a nice suite that's got them all. And it ends with Hetty Wainthropp Investigates, which is really... But one of my favourites has always been East Coast Pictures. The Bardi Wind Orchestra has only done the New York part, which is the exciting bit. And I thought, why not? Why not have the Bardi Wind Orchestra play it to us?
Well, we'll talk about the Bardi Wind Orchestra after we've heard this performance of a piece by Nigel Hess. The Bardi Wind Orchestra, conducted by David Calow, playing New York from East Coast Pictures by Nigel Hess. Let's talk a little bit about the Bardi Wind Orchestra now, of which you are the conductor. How did that start, David?
Yes, as you said at the beginning of this evening, John, it was an idea that Robert and I had, sitting in the middle of a massive orchestra of 120 players on De Montfort Hall stage when we played both Mahler's Sixth Symphony and Second Symphony, thinking you've got a very big wind ensemble here. Why don't we take that out of the symphony orchestra and form a wind band from it? As you said, the committee thought, and especially Andrew Constantine thought, that would be a rather interesting idea. Leave it in your capable hands, because, of course, we'd played in the wind band at school and everything. So we started the idea, right, we've got the players because they're all in the Bardi Orchestra anyway. We need a conductor. So we approached Martin Slip. And at the time, he was conducting the top symphonic wind band at Leicestershire School of Music. And he was the ideal guy to do it as an expert in the repertoire. He really was. And he conducted the first two. Although in the second one, I sneaked in and conducted a very small piece of Percy Grainger for clarinet choir called the Movable Doe, which is a quirky little piece. Once we got to the third seasonal year of doing it, Martin's, I think his schedule got very, very busy. And because I'd done this bit of conducting with this one, he said, do you fancy taking it over? You've set it up. So I thought, why not? We'll have a go. We'll try and do one concert, and if it fails, we will, And I've been conducting them all ever since.
So and you say you've been conducting them all ever since, and presumably sort of learning to conduct on the job.
That's right. I mean, the very first one, I look back at the repertoire that Robert and I decided to do, and you think, wow. Right? The players were up for it, I was up for it, and we got through it all and we did it. There was one or two corners, as it were, but you learn on the job, John, as you say. You've got the music in front of you. You suddenly realise what does work and what doesn't work.
And we should say that not all the musicians play for the Bardi Symphony Orchestra. You get wind musicians coming just to play from quite long distances, I think.
The Symphony Orchestra only has perhaps a 12-strong wind section. Mostly the brass section can be the same people, but we need an extended clarinet choir. The standard clarinet choir of the Bardi Wind Orchestra, which you can see here, is probably an E-flat clarinet, 12 B-flat clarinets, on the alto clarinet, one or two bass clarinets and a contrabass clarinet in E-flat. And that's the string section of a wind orchestra, and that makes all the difference.
But as well as conducting, you and your brother also do arrangements for it.
We do, and that goes back to the school band and our fantastic music teacher, David Edwards. We grew up learning our instruments, learning the music in the wind bands and watching him arrange the music for the people and encouraging us to do the same thing. So that's the bug we caught at school, and we carried it on through both university, and then we got to the Bardi Wind Orchestra and said, yeah, we'd like to do arrangements, and we can license these arrangements. The ones we do, you can talk to MCA in London and have a licensed arrangement with your name on it. It's great fun. It's good.
And I mean, I've said this to you before, but I sometimes think that there's nothing you can't actually arrange for wind orchestra. I mean, who'd have thought that Mistletoe and Wine would make a bit of a hit performance at the Christmas concerts, for example?
Well, there's a big brass ensemble bit in it, which is easy, but you're right, it's the other bit. So once you put in the keyboard, it's listening to the sound of an orchestra and trying to imagine it on the clarinets and the flutes and perhaps the oboes, and using the more interesting ensemble colours. The euphonium is the key instrument in the wind band. It's the cello section all on its own on one instrument. And if you get that part right, the whole thing fits together very well.
Well, I've loved being involved with the wind band over the years at Christmas concerts. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. Christmas comes with the wind band concert at Christmas, and looking forward very much indeed to being there this year.
Fingers crossed. You've compared some of the summer concerts as well, John, in the early days.
I did, yes.
So you've been there from the very beginning. So.
Wonderful sound. Now, another kind of music, another genre of music you've been heavily involved in over the years is the musical theatre. Was that something, well, you suggested it was, that you heard at home, musicals and so on?
Yes, certainly, through whether it was Mantovani's records or seeing things perhaps on the television. But as this picture shows here, I think the seeds were sown when you've got your parents meeting in amateur dramatics and bringing that into the family as well. So there's mum in the middle and dad with his flat cap on, acting in a play somewhere in the middle of the 1950s. They met I think, at this theatre production place, and were married soon afterwards. Once the family had sort of grown up and we could look after ourselves, Mum went back into the theatre and was a very accomplished sort of director, acting in lots of local stuff, and was always down the little theatre watching shows, and she still enjoys it now. She even dragged me onto the stage as well. When I came back from college, I appeared in 3 shows with her on the local stage. One of them was, I think, Mayflower Church. Great fun. But I think I got the bug of being behind stage, doing the scenery stuff, painting that rather than treading the boards, as it were. But it was great fun when I did it. It was good.
And you were heavily involved with, well, a monster performance in Leicester, Jesus Christ Superstar. Now, that's a story in itself.
That's it, which is one of these things, obviously having the music and the theatre stuff perhaps in the blood and in the background. Back in 1993, our church is the Wigston Magna Methodist Church, and we just renovated it. So it was a really big sort of performance area in Wigston. And literally one Sunday morning, a chap turned up at the church, Paul Tuffin, and said, "I'm a theatre director, local drama teacher. You're the musician I hear. Do you want to do Jesus Christ Superstar in this church?" And I thought, what do you mean, do Jesus Christ? Do the whole thing, a full production. You can sort the music and the orchestra. I'll do the theatre bit. We'll get a full lighting rig in and we'll do it. And we did. And it was quite a big thing for the time, because you have to realise the music of Lloyd Webber and et al. At the time wasn't Jesus Christ Superstar. It was Phantom and Evita.
Yes.
That sort of Jesus Christ Superstar was sort of relegated a little bit back to the back. The schools did Joseph. No problem at all. So I can remember, I've got the letter, I dug it out when we were looking at this interview here. It's a handwritten letter to David Land of Superstar Productions, who was in charge of Jesus Christ. It's way before the Really Useful company. And he personally licensed us to do it as a one-off performance over 3 or 4 nights, because it was at a church as a religious performance. Otherwise, you weren't allowed to do any of these musicals at all.
And it was a full performance of the score. How many people were involved in this then?
Well, I dug the programme out, and here it is, all the details of it all. We had this. I was looking in the orchestra. The string parts were covered by a keyboard, which it was written from the keyboard. We had a full wind section and a mini brass section, 3 guitars and a 2-part percussion section. So it filled one half of the church, just the orchestra.
And a chorus, and of course...
And the church choir was the chorus. We had lots of youngsters in the church, a lot of them who were at Gaflaxton with Brian Humperson, who did drama and music with him. So they were the ideal youngsters to get involved. Peter Sala was our minister, and his wife Jane was Mary Magdalene in that. She had a superb voice. And that's Andy. He played Jesus, and he's still an actor today. That's his job.
Gosh, I mean, that must have been quite nerve-wracking, knowing that you got to keep this huge number of people on the rails, keep them all together.
Yeah, it's, and again, you sort of learn on the job. I've got my notes out. You sort of, each rehearsal was a tight schedule to try and get it done. It came together. There's 1 or 2 issues as there is on the first night, but the remaining nights went really well. It hung together. I think it was a great learning curve for me to do a massive piece of things that have got rhythm and guitars and drums and stuff in, which was well out of my comfort zone.
Well remembered by those who were there, I'm absolutely certain. We're going to talk more about your involvement in orchestra pits for shows after we've heard from Jesus Christ Superstar. What bit are we going to hear?
I think it's because it was my first show. When you got to this bit, this was the very last piece the orchestra played, and it's purely for orchestra. It's John 19:41, and the words that go with it are, "Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, which no one had yet been laid." So you've had the crucifixion scene, which you can see here. The music just comes out of blackness. The stage is completely dark, and then this wonderful piece of music evolves, and it's one of Lloyd Webber's finest melodies, and that's what finishes the actual musical off.
Let's hear it now. Sorry for interrupting Mr. Lloyd Webber there. That's music from the end of Jesus Christ Superstar, which was your kind of breakthrough show, I suppose, in conducting musicals, David. And then you had 10 happy years after that in orchestra pits, didn't you?
That's right. I mean, the second show we did at church was Godspell, and after that, I was sort of headhunted, if that's the right word, by the Idols operatic group that perform in the Little Theatre to ask to be their musical director for South Pacific. And because I knew that musical extremely well, because Dad had played the records all the while and he knew all the songs, a lot of the words, I thought, yes, at least I know the product. I'll go and do this. And it ended up being 10 enjoyable years in the Little Theatre doing fantastic Broadway shows. And here's a selection of them. Absolutely.
Well, I heard a very interesting story about South Pacific only earlier this week on the radio. When it was first on, it began to be toured. Some local places got very nervous about that song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. And they tried to persuade, Rodgers and Hammerstein to take it out. And they absolutely stood by and said, if we take it out, that's the show down the drain, because that's what the show is all about. Yeah. It's about standing up against racism and prejudice. If you take it out, you take out the heart of it. Yeah. And that's perfectly true. It was a radical show in all sorts of ways for its day, wasn't it?
It certainly was. And I remember changing when, right at the very end, we changed everything the other way around after the first night because all the lighting didn't work and things like that. It's a sort of a production going on. Yeah, one or two of the shows have interesting bits. Best Little Warhouse in Texas, you can't do the big Dolly Parton song because that's only licensed for the film. So lots of people were disappointed they didn't hear that. And for Seven Brides and Seven Brothers, it's a brand new show written in 1985 that only has two of the numbers in it, the main numbers.
So people were disappointed then.
We had to clearly tell them that you're not going to see the polecat dance in this because it's not in it,
Do you have a favourite musical?
I think it had to be Guys and Dolls, only because we could have done a second week. We all felt it was so good. And when you're doing showstoppers like Rocking the Boat,
yes.
You've got some really good music. It was great fun, it really was.
Frank Letter, a wonderful show, not a duff song in the whole evening, and full of humour and romance and excitement. Just brilliant, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Wonderful stuff. And you obviously enjoyed being in the pit. Of course, the pit, you do stick up a little bit in some of them. You're not underground or anything like that. But working with those bands must have been good fun.
There was only one show, and it's actually not on there. For The King and I, the orchestra was behind the stage. And that was the first time that had ever been done in the Little Theatre. It was a sort of because we had video monitors for the first time to try and do it, and it worked successfully. Yeah. But most of the time, yes, we're in the pit.
Okay, now we're going to move on again to something completely different, as they say. When I was interviewing Robert, he spoke about his, I call it an obsession really, but I suppose that's a little bit unfair, with the unfinished opera of Puccini, which is Turandot, and there was a kind of a conclusion written by Alfano, which was mucked about by Toscanini, the first conductor. And I know that Robert has done a lot of research into this ending, but you have also been fascinated by another work which was unfinished. Now, tell us about that.
Right, the picture here shows Robert and myself in the Gateway Music Department, probably writing harmony and theory stuff. But at the same time, every lunchtime, we used to have the music teacher take a classic piece of music, whether it was a Grieg piano concerto or a symphony, and take us through it. He took us through on one lunchtime Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. And I think that set the bug in my mind, sort of saying, why did he not leave it? Why did he not finish it? What went wrong? And of course, the thing resolved itself in 2009. So I had to wait a little while before I answered the question.
When you say resolved itself, what do you mean?
There was actually a proper third movement already written. And here it is. So rather than having just the two movements we know in the concert hall, there was actually a third movement, virtually complete, both in orchestra and piano score, and a very clear possible indication of what the fourth movement would have been. But it's only really in modern technology, looking at paper and people finding music, that Professor Brian Newbold, who there you can see in the picture, formulated the plan, reconstructed in the fourth movement, and then added the final part of the Scherzo trio. So you can actually perform the symphony with four movements.
Which you did.
That's right. So I actually rang him up out of the blue and said, would you mind me sending me or hiring the parts for the third movement? Of course I will do. Do you want me to come to the concert? And this is one of the concerts with the Rutland Sinfonia. because the Rutland Symphony has a great reputation for doing challenging, different sort of music. So we did. Professor Brian turned up for actually 2 concerts with Schubert's music, but the first one was a complete concert with all the Rosamunde music, then a 4-movement version of the unfinished symphony in the second half.
And that was the sort of Midlands premiere of this completed version.
It's, and then the 7th Symphony, which I did 2 years later. Brian came again and talked about it. So he'd recorded it with the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, done local work in London and in Hull at his university, but we were the first people to do these arrangements or reconstructions in the Midlands.
And he came along, watched it. Was he pleased with what he heard?
I think he was. I think it's just nice to have his music or his arrangement played. And the unfinished was just really the 3rd movement, because the 4th movement is the entr'acte from the big piece of Rosamunde music anyway. The 7th Symphony, which we did 2 years later, was much more of a brand new reconstruction of the framework of the symphony, and that was fascinating.
Well, you mentioned the Rutland Symphonia, and that's yet another sort of orchestra that you're involved with.
That's right. I first played with the Symphony back in 1988 under Barry Collett, a superb conductor, and Paul Hearn and I took over the conducting roles in 2007, and Paul does 3 concerts and I do the 4th concert. So between the 2 of us, we've had over 10 years going, 12 years now conducting it.
Well, we can't not now hear part of the recording, not the recording with the Rutland Symphonia, sadly, of the reconstructed unfinished symphony, now finished by Schubert. Schubert, conducted there by Sir Charles Mackerras and the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. Just before we continue, could I just say that at the end, we've got 2 more pieces to music to go. At the end of this interview, you will have an opportunity to ask a question of our guest, David Calow. So please be thinking about that now. I'll explain how you can make your intention to ask a question apparent to us a little later on. But we're going to move on now, David, to yet another musical ensemble with which you are involved. Tell us about this, if you will, please.
It's my new band, if you want to say that. The CPO, the Clarendon Park Orchestra, has actually been around for quite a while, probably from the 90s and stuff. So, but I took over conducting this in 2015. It has an interesting history, which has a very strong connection with the Bardi, in the sense that Andrew Constantine did some evening classes at the Richard Attenborough Centre in conducting. I couldn't, unfortunately, attend because I was conducting the Idols, doing their rehearsal stuff. But of the 5 people that took the course on, they all went to form orchestras, whether it was Paul Jenkins doing the Night and Chamber, other people. Jo Conquest, she's obviously one of the top flute players in the county. She conducted the Leicestershire Schools ensembles. And Anne Dixon took over. She was one of the cellists, I think, from the Leicester Symphony. Wanted to form an orchestra just to have every other Friday, community orchestra to enjoy playing music. She retired herself, I believe, around 2013. My good friend Jo Conquest took over for a year, and then I followed her and took over in 2015, and it's now on the books a 60-strong orchestra.
Give us an idea of the kind of music you play.
It's changed over the years because it's a bigger orchestra and there's a lot more sort of confidence in it. We can do concerts now like we did last February, where we start off with Finlandia. We can do the first movement of a Beethoven symphony, the last movement of Mozart symphonies, but also film and television scores. And
the musicians are there for the fun of it, really.
They are. A lot of them would have called themselves retired from playing in perhaps in other local orchestras, but just enjoy coming out on a Friday evening, enjoy playing in a normal setup. We sit in the right place, we tune up, we rehearse, we have a good 20-minute break and coffee chat, but it's great fun.
And doesn't it show how much musical activity in normal times, I'm not talking necessarily about the moment, in normal times there is in the city and the county?
It's fantastic to see the people getting together to do it. And I think we've got so many orchestras and ensembles in the city and county. We cater for every level of performer, which is great.
What are we going to hear now?
It's one of the pieces we did last February. And it's one of the pieces that most of the players in the orchestra had never heard before, but it's one of my favourites. Vaughan Williams is easily one of my top composers, whether it's the symphonies, some of the orchestral works, and certainly the film music. This was the first film score Vaughan Williams was asked to write in the war, and it's a prelude to the 49th parallel.
Let's hear it. That really couldn't be by anyone else, could it?
No, not at all.
Vaughan Williams, music from the film 49th Parallel, and that was the RTE Concert Orchestra conducted by Andrew Penny. We're almost at the end of our time together, but we've got one more piece of music to go. And the first picture that we see now takes us back again. Now, why is that? What are we looking at?
It takes us back to school. This is the Gateway Grammar School Choir, and it really takes us back to an era when the man right on the right-hand side is David Edwards, a brilliant music teacher. And again, really, his inspirational teaching and what he got us to do, all the players in the orchestra and in the music department throughout the 7 years we were there. A real inspiration. He left Gateway soon after we did and went to Beecham and did exactly the same thing there, built the music department up. But without him, I don't think myself and Robert will be doing, and all of them remained in the music department, doing what we do now. We learned how to put concerts on, arrange stuff, compose bits. I had my first dabbling and conducting stuff there. It was absolutely fantastic.
So he's got a lot to be thankful for in your case then.
Yeah, he has. Yeah,
one of the composers who I know you really love, and we haven't heard from so far, is Dvorak. And I can understand why, because, well, I think his symphonies and other music is just wonderful, full of most glorious melodies, but also drama and melancholy. And it's Dvorak's Seventh Symphony, which you've chosen. Now, can you explain why?
It's because it was my A-level set work. When David Edwards, the music teacher, said, "What do we?" We had the choice of the Bach Mass in B minor or an orchestral symphony, and it was a no-brainer. It had to be the orchestral symphony. It wasn't the one I knew. I knew number 8 and 9 just about by that stage, so it was a new work to me, and I'm glad it was, because it was a great piece to look at structure, harmony, orchestration, and in depth at the composer and what a genius he was at writing melody. He was super.
Also, it has to be said, a nice man, and not all conductors are nice men, are they?
No, I mean, he was a brilliant conductor of his own music, but he had such passions. He was an avid train spotter and a collector of pigeons.
Well, I knew he was a train spotter. I didn't know he was a collector of pigeons.
He included the pigeons in the New World Symphony. They coo in one bit. So.
And I presume that you've played the flute parts in Dvorak's symphonies.
I played the symphony once in the Bardi, and we recorded it with Andrew. It was the first recording the Bardi did, so I was playing second flute and piccolo in it. But I've also tried to play all the flute solos in the first flute parts, and they're very difficult, but they're gorgeous stuff. So yeah, it was great at school trying to play all the solo work in it. But it was a fantastic work to study. It was really good to study it at A level. And the piece we're going to actually hear is the very end of it, because I was always impressed how Dvorak could bring all these themes together and then from the D minor bring it into D major with the most glorious end.
So this is the great triumphant conclusion of one of your favourite symphonies then, right from the... Well, let's hear that now. Not sadly the Bardi Orchestra, but this is the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, conducted by James Levine. Glorious climax to Dvorak's Seventh Symphony. Wow, what a wonderful piece to end this chat with. Although, David, of course, we haven't quite got to the end yet, because we hope that there will be a few questions for you. In the meantime, one more question to our guest, David. David, it's been a huge pleasure talking to you this evening and finding out about your taste in music and your musical career. Let's look ahead to the future, because we've been living through, as has frequently been said, some very odd times. But as I've already mentioned, we are looking forward to a time when we can have live music, and the Wind Band and the Bardi Symphony Orchestra will be playing again. What's on the menu for between now and the new year?
Well, fingers crossed. A month tomorrow, hopefully the Bardi Wind Orchestra will be playing at Hinckley and a prom concert in their park. So we are working towards a serious outside concert with music to be put together for that. The Bardi Symphony has a full season planned with 4 concerts starting in October. That'll be, I think, released next week, both by the orchestra and the Montfort Hall. But of course, these are all provisional plans. We hope we can do it all. But there's plans there for 4 major concerts starting in October. The Bardi Wind, this proms concert in September. And hopefully you and I are in Holy Trinity Church for the Christmas concert at the end of the year, John.
Well, I really hope so, because in all seriousness, I don't know about you, I really missed it last December.
Yeah. It was a big gulf in the sort of the year, wasn't it?
It really was. It really was. And those Christmas concerts are always a huge pleasure, the celebration that only music can bring.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm pleased to say that a yellow hand has been raised. And I think it's Robert who wants to ask a question. Hello.
John, hello, David. Yes, David, you've already told us about James Galway and 3 different flutes. I don't think you explained what flute you've got, which might be interesting to everybody, but would you like a gold flute or a platinum flute, or would Mrs. Calow let you buy one?
I've played on one, and it was very heavy. My flute is a Pearl 1985 solid silver flute, and it's called a thick wall flute because at that time silver was cheaper than it is now, so you could have more silver in it. The headpiece is actually something quite special. It's a Mike Allen special headpiece, again designed and made by hand in 1985. So the two of them go together very well. You've got a big chunk of metal handmade to make the sound really rich. And then the flute is the state-of-the-art stuff done by Pearl in 1985. I'm very pleased with it. It's quite heavy compared with most modern flutes, but I've always enjoyed the sort of the weight of it and how it plays. It's got a really big sonorous sound.
The other interesting thing, perhaps I'll explain, what about the mouthpiece, the actual lip part?
Yeah, this is, again, Mike Allen is an expert in making those, and my lip plate has been as if it's hammered with small little divots in it, and it sits in there and doesn't move in the summer. And that's been the biggest bane of my life, that everything slips all over the place when you're in a very hot church in May. So that's resolved that problem. But the biggest thing that a lot of flute players have got is a thumb port, and it's a little gadget that you put on your flute that your thumb fits in to stop the flute tilting as well. So there's a bit of modern high tech now involved in flutes. But it's a great flute. It's showing its age a bit, but it was well made back in 1985.
Well, thank you for your question, Mr. Bardi Live Session. Robert, have we got any more people who want to ask questions?
No, come on, everybody. You're out there. Ah, yes.
My relation.
It's Andrew, I think, isn't it? Yes. Would you like to unmute yourself, Andrew, and ask your question?
Thank you, John. Yes, what I'd like to ask, as a conductor, what David's opinion is of having applause between movements in a piece.
It depends what symphony it is. There's some Beethoven's 7 is a perfect one. Once you've done the skirts and the trio, you have to attack the finale. I get really annoyed when there's an enormous gap at the end of that. The audience cough and splutter, and then you go yan-da-da-dam. That has to go straight in attacker to me. It doesn't say you do it in the score, but there's lots of works when you've done the movement, and I think you've got to let the music sit. And even if it's in a symphonic piece, often there's a very big gap at the end of Nimrod, for instance, because I think you need to let that music relax before you get onto the next bit. So you're quite right, Andrew. Some symphonies demand it, often others don't. But I think if you have too big a gap, it won't work. You need a bit of continuity going through.
I think I'm right in saying that the idea of clapping between movements is actually a revival of something quite old.
Absolutely.
There's plenty of records of people conducting, of clapping, I should say, applauding between movements of Beethoven symphonies, and getting them to repeat the movement before they go on. So
it's a famous one, John. The first time we performed Beethoven 9. It was being done on the proms, and they had a review of the very first performance. So there was big applause between each movement, and at the beginning of the last movement, when the timpani goes, it was bam, bam, bam. Yeah. They stopped and applauded the timpani player. So, yes,
Just briefly, what's your thought? What are your thoughts about this, Andrew?
I don't like it. I think you want to. If I go to a concert, I've paid to hear the musicians and not the audience.
Good point. Thank you, Andrew. And we've got Christine on the line. Unmute yourself, please, Christine, and ask a question.
Hi, David.
Hello, Christine.
I always find it interesting hearing how people chose the instrument.
Yeah.
And hearing how you didn't want to play the same instrument as Robert.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, have you ever regretted or have you ever envied not having played another instrument?
Yes, because both our children and Robert's two children, they were sensible. They don't play the woodwind instruments as such. And my son plays the French horn. So I had to get to grips with what the French horn's all about. And I think if I played another instrument, it'd either be a cello or a French horn. The more Ian played the French horn, the more I thought I'd love to in the middle of a horn section, blasting those big melodies out. It's not quite the same. I mean, I enjoy playing squeaky piccolo stuff, but there's something, and that's basically because I sit next to the Bardi horn section when I was playing with the symphony orchestra on the end. But to hear the four of them play together, I think that's the section I'd migrate to.
And would you ever consider learning an instrument again now?
I tried the horn for a little bit and he just wrecked my embouchure. So I think it had to be a string instrument, and something like a cello might be interesting, but I don't know. The Calow in the distant going back, the Calow's made string instrument, so perhaps it's in the blood somewhere. But I think it'd be a string instrument, Christine.
Difficult to lug around a cello, that's the problem, isn't it?
Especially when you're used to a piccolo, John, yeah.
Christine, thank you very much indeed for your question. Good to hear from you. I think that we haven't got any more. I'm just looking at the screen. No, I don't think so. But we do have an announcement, David. I think you're going to make it, aren't you?
Well, there we are. So our next interviewee is Dr. John Florance himself. So we've turned the tables on our interviewer. So from that point of view, you're the next subject, John, and that'll be on Friday the 10th of September. So we'll be tuning in to see what your 8 choices are.
Well, I don't mind telling you that I'm already nerve-wracked at the prospect of this, being on the receiving end of these questions. So I hope very much indeed it goes well. But no, seriously, I think it's going to be a terrible job choosing all these questions, but all these pieces of music. But there we are. And David, it remains for me to thank you very much indeed for providing us with such an entertaining evening. And I'd also like to thank Robert and Alan, as well as David, for doing the technical presentation this evening, making everything work. And I might say it was a bit nerve-wracking before we started this evening because we were having some technical problems, but they seem to have ironed themselves out. Yeah. Just to say that you can watch this programme and others in the series via the Bardi website, www.bardi.org.uk, and you can see all the other interviews. They're all there, not to be missed. So until next time, when I shall be sitting in the chair occupied this evening by David, let us say farewell, thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.